Neon pulse of a world where every flickering light represents a choice, a chance, or a hidden secret. We capture the high-stakes drama of the streets through a cinematic lens of glowing colors. Subscribe today and keep your finger on the pulse of the night. My son-in-law called me a bitter old man who couldn't let go of the past. He said it right to my face, in my own kitchen, with my daughter standing 3 feet away saying nothing. I want you to remember that moment, because everything that came after started right there. My name is Robert Calloway. I'm 67 years old, and for the last 4 years, I was the invisible man in my own family. Not because I was difficult, not because I caused trouble, but because I was useful. I paid bills. I transferred money. I showed up when called and disappeared when not needed. I was the ATM with a heartbeat, and I didn't even know it until the day my son-in-law looked me dead in the eye and told me my opinion didn't matter in his house. His house. The house I was paying half the mortgage on. Let me take you back to where this really began, because the story didn't start with an insult. It started with grief. My wife Carol passed 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer. 12 weeks from diagnosis to gone. We had been married 38 years, raised our daughter Melissa together, built a life in Nashville that I was proud of. When Carol died, something in me just emptied out. I retired from my engineering position at the firm 6 months later because I couldn't concentrate, couldn't focus, couldn't make myself care about load calculations when the woman I had loved since I was 29 years old was buried in Harpeth Hills Cemetery. Melissa was my reason to keep going. She was 31 then, already married to Derek Webb for 2 years. They lived about 20 minutes from me in a nice neighborhood in Franklin, Tennessee. After Carol passed, I started coming around more. Dinners on Sundays, helping with the yard, fixing things in the house because Derek, despite being 33 years old, could not figure out how a circuit breaker worked. I didn't mind. I wanted to feel needed. That's the honest truth, and it's the thing I'm most ashamed of now. I wanted to feel like I still had a family, so I ignored every sign that I was being managed rather than loved. The money started slowly. Melissa called 6 months after Carol died and said they were having trouble with the mortgage since Derek had switched jobs. Could I help just for a couple months? I sent $3,000 without a second thought. Then Derek started a landscaping business and needed equipment. Another $4,000. Then Melissa wanted to finish her basement, and they were a little short. Then there was the car. Then the medical bills from Derek's back surgery. Then the new roof. Then. By the time I started keeping track, I had given or lent, and I use that word loosely because not a single dollar ever came back. Over $58,000 in 3.5 years. $58,000 of the retirement Carol and I had spent decades building together. And what did I get in return? I got to sit at the far end of the dinner table while Derek talked over me. I got to be introduced to their friends as Melissa's dad with a kind of tone that suggested I was a mild inconvenience. I got uninvited from their Christmas party because Derek said it was just for their generation and he didn't want things to be awkward. I found out about that party from my neighbor, whose daughter had been invited. I sat at home that night with a bourbon I didn't finish and stared at a photo of Carol on the mantel. I think that was the first night something started hardening inside me. But the moment that broke the dam was a Tuesday afternoon in March. I had driven over to drop off a check. Melissa had texted saying they needed help with a balloon payment on the business loan, and I had written the check on the drive over like a fool, already filled out, already signed. I knocked and Derek answered still in his work clothes, dirt on his boots, and barely stepped back to let me in. I handed him the envelope. He took it without looking at it, set it on the kitchen counter, and turned back to his coffee. I stood there for a moment, then said I had been thinking about Thanksgiving and wanted to know if we were doing it at my place this year like we used to when Carol was alive. Derek turned around slowly, leaned against the counter, and looked at me with the kind of patience you give a child who keeps asking the same question. He said, "Robert, I think you need to understand something. This is our home and our family. We decide how we spend our holidays. You're welcome to join us when it works, but we're not going to plan our life around your schedule just because you write us a check now and then. Just because I write them a check." I heard Melissa in the hallway. She had heard everything. She didn't say a word. I looked at my son-in-law standing in a kitchen I had helped pay for, holding an envelope with my money in it, and I heard Carol's voice in my head as clearly as if she were standing beside me. She said, "Bobby, what are you doing?" I said, "You're right, Derek. I apologize for overstepping." I walked out. I sat in my truck in their driveway for 4 minutes. Then I drove home. That night I didn't sleep. I went through 4 years of bank statements at my kitchen table. $58,420. I wrote it on a piece of paper and stared at it until sunrise. I wasn't angry yet. I was something worse than angry. I was clear. I called my bank the next morning and spoke with my account manager, a woman named Patricia who had handled my accounts for 11 years. I told her I needed to cancel all automatic transfers and remove Melissa and Derek from any authorized access to my accounts. Patricia paused for just a moment, then said she would take care of it immediately and asked if everything was all right. I told her it was better than it had been in a long time. My phone started ringing at 11:15 that morning. Derek first, which surprised me. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that started professional and ended with the words disappointing and selfish. Melissa called at noon, then again at 12:40. I listened to her second voicemail twice. She sounded confused, not angry, and something in her voice reminded me of the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives, and for a moment I almost called back. Then I remembered her standing in that hallway saying nothing. I didn't answer. They showed up at my house 2 days later. I saw Derek's truck pull in from my window and I stayed in my chair. He knocked hard, 3 times. Then Melissa knocked softer. I opened the door. Melissa looked like she hadn't slept. Derek looked like he had spent 2 days building up steam. He pushed in before I fully opened the door, which told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. He started talking before he was fully inside. Said I was manipulating them, that I had spent years dangling money to control their lives, that canceling the transfers was financial abuse, that I was punishing them for having boundaries. Their boundaries. That word, in my house, after what he had said to me in his kitchen. I let him finish. Then I said, Derek, I need you to leave my home. He told me I was being dramatic. I told him I would call the police if he didn't leave. Melissa grabbed his arm, and for a moment they had a conversation with their eyes that I wasn't part of, and then they left. I closed the door and stood in my entryway in the silence, and I felt something I hadn't felt since Carol got sick. I felt afraid. Not of Derek, not exactly. Afraid that I had just blown up the last family I had. My next-door neighbor, Frank Delaney, knocked on my door about an hour later. Frank is 64, retired military, and has the observational habits of a man who spent 30 years watching for things that didn't belong. He had seen Derek's truck, seen them leave, and came over with 2 beers and the look of a man who had something to say. We sat on my back porch and I told him everything, all of it. The money, the Thanksgiving conversation, the hallway, the check. Frank listened without interrupting, which is a skill most people don't have. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Robert, how much do you actually know about Derek's business? I said I knew he ran a landscaping company, that it had been struggling. That was why I'd been helping. Frank set down his beer. He said, I've seen a truck at your daughter's house about twice a week for the past 8 months. White Ford F-250. Not Derek's truck, not a work truck. It parks down the street and the driver walks up, stays a couple hours, leaves before Derek gets home. I stared at him. He said he hadn't said anything because he wasn't sure it was his business. But given what I'd just told him, he thought I should know. I drove home from that conversation feeling a cold, focused kind of thinking settle over me. I'm an engineer by trade. I solve problems by gathering data before I act. I decided that before I did anything else, I was going to know exactly what I was dealing with. I called my attorney the following Monday. David Harmon had handled Carol's estate, and I trusted him completely. I told him I needed a referral to a private investigator, someone discreet and experienced. He gave me a name without hesitation, a woman named Gloria Reyes who had her own firm in Brentwood. He said she was the best he'd ever worked with. Gloria met me for coffee, and I told her what Frank had told me and what I suspected. She didn't react with surprise or drama. She just opened a small notebook and started writing. She said she would need 2 weeks and would have a full report. 13 days later, Gloria sat across from me at David's conference table and laid a folder in front of me. The man in the white truck was named Scott Parrish. He was 37, divorced, and worked as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company. He and Melissa had been meeting at the house regularly for 10 months. Gloria had timestamps, photographs, and had traced his plates. There was no ambiguity about the nature of the relationship, but that wasn't the part that stopped my breath. Gloria had also run a full background on Derek's landscaping business while she was at it. She said when she finds a thread, she pulls it. What she found was that Webb Landscaping LLC had been dissolved 8 months ago, quietly, without announcement, while Derek was still depositing my checks and telling Melissa they needed money for the business loan. There was no business loan. There had been no active business for 8 months. The equipment I had helped purchase had been sold at auction in October. Derek had been depositing my money into a personal account and had been making payments on a boat stored at a marina in Hendersonville. A boat. I sat in that conference room for a long moment after Gloria finished. David was watching me carefully. I said, "Tell me what I can do." David leaned forward. He said what Derek had done was fraud, taking money under false pretenses, claiming a business need that didn't exist. He said we could file civil claims for full recovery of the funds transferred after the business was dissolved, potentially more with punitive damages. He said if we involved the district attorney, which the evidence supported, it could become criminal. He also said, carefully, that Melissa's involvement or knowledge would be a central question, and that I needed to think hard about what I wanted the outcome to look like. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds. I said, I want every dollar back, and I want Derek Webb to understand what he did. David nodded. Gloria closed her notebook. We got to work. The civil filing happened first. Derek was served on a Wednesday morning. Gloria had timed it for when she knew he would be home alone, because she is extremely good at her job. David told me Derek called his office twice that afternoon, and both times the receptionist told him David was unavailable. Melissa called me that evening. This time, I answered. She was crying before she said a word. She said she didn't know about the business being closed, said she had no idea where the money had been going. Her voice was shaking in a way I recognized. I had heard that voice when she was 16, and had broken something she was afraid to tell me about. It was the voice she used when she was genuinely scared. I said, Melissa, I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did you know Derek had closed the business? She said no. I believed her. I said, then you need to get a lawyer. Not Derek's lawyer. Your own. Silence for a moment. Then she asked why. I said, because I think you have bigger problems in your marriage than you know about, and you need someone in your corner who is looking out for you specifically. She didn't ask me what I meant. I think part of her already knew. She got her own attorney, a woman named Carla Bryant, who David recommended. 2 weeks later, Melissa filed for divorce. I found out from David, not from Melissa, which is fine. I understood. The civil trial was 4 months later. Derek hired a lawyer who spent the early part of the proceedings arguing that the transfers were gifts. David was prepared for this completely. He had text messages from Derek asking for money and specifying business purposes, emails referencing the business loan, and bank records showing the business account had been closed the entire time the requests were being made. He had Gloria's documentation of the boat, the auction records, the marina registration. Derek's lawyer got quieter as the day went on. The judge awarded full recovery of the fraudulently obtained funds, which David had calculated at $31,000 covering the period after the business closure, plus interest, plus legal fees. The district attorney, who had been watching the civil proceedings, filed criminal charges for fraud the following week. Derek accepted a plea agreement that included restitution, 3 years of probation, and a fraud conviction on his record. The boat was sold to cover part of the restitution. I found that detail oddly satisfying. Outside the courthouse after the civil verdict, I stood on the steps in the late afternoon sun and felt the particular kind of tired that comes after a long fight finally ends. Frank was there. He had driven down without me asking. He handed me a coffee from the place across the street, and we stood there without saying much, which is the best kind of company. Melissa was not there. We had spoken twice during the 4 months, both times brief and careful, like people moving around sharp things in a dark room. I didn't blame her. Her marriage had collapsed. Her husband had been defrauding her own father, and she had been living with a man who had been lying to her about the state of their finances for nearly a year. She had her own grief to carry. I wasn't going to rush it. 3 months after the verdict, she came to my door on a Sunday morning with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Main Street that Carol used to love. She stood on my porch looking like she had been rehearsing something. I opened the door and she handed me the coffee and said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry I didn't say anything in that kitchen." I had thought about this moment. I had turned it over many times, rehearsed my own version of what I wanted to say. I just stepped back and let her in. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. She told me things I hadn't known, about how Derek had gradually isolated her from her own opinions, made her feel like her instincts were always wrong, made her feel like my involvement in their lives was something to manage rather than appreciate. She said she had known something was wrong for a long time and had been too afraid to look at it directly. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When she finished, I said, "I need you to know that I wasn't paying for love. I want you to understand that. I was paying because I wanted to be close to you, and I confused the two, and that's on me." She started crying again. I got up and put my hand on her shoulder the way I used to when she was small and the world felt too big. After a moment, she put her hand over mine. We're not back to where we were. I don't know if we ever will be entirely. But we're talking, really talking. And that's more than I had on the morning I sat at my kitchen table with $58,000 written on a piece of paper. Frank and I have started having dinner together on Thursday nights. His wife passed 2 years ago, and we have that particular thing in common now. We take turns cooking, which means alternating between his chili and my considerably less impressive pasta. And we talk about things that matter and things that don't. And it turns out that kind of friendship is something I hadn't realized I was missing. I still live in the same house in Nashville. The same photo of Carol is on the mantel, but I look at it differently now. Not with the desperate loneliness I felt those first years after she was gone. Not with the guilt of a man who thought he could buy his way back into feeling like he had a family. I look at it like a man who finally remembered what she always told me when I was too giving for my own good. She used to say, "Bobby, you can't pour from an empty cup, and you can't fill a cup that has a hole in the bottom." It took me 4 years and $58,000 to really understand what she meant. If you're listening to this, and something in it feels familiar, I want to say this directly. The fear of being alone is real. I know it. After Carol died, I would have done almost anything to not sit in that quiet house by myself, and people who pay attention to that kind of vulnerability can find it very easily. They don't always look dangerous. Sometimes they look like family. The moment someone starts making you feel like your presence requires a financial justification, that is not love. That is a transaction, and you are allowed to stop transacting. Generosity is a beautiful thing when it is given freely to people who value you as a person. When it becomes the price of admission to your own family, it is no longer generosity. It is something being taken from you, and there is no shame in deciding that it stops today. I am 67 years old. I have a daughter I am learning to trust again, a friend who shows up without being asked, and the clearest sense of myself I have had in years. I am not bitter. I am not broken. I know exactly who I am, and exactly what I will and will not accept. And I am sleeping better than I have in a very long time. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you're fighting your own version of this, know that the fight is worth having. It is never too late to decide that you matter, not because of what you can give, but because of who you are. My name is Robert Calloway. I spent 4 years being invisible.